Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We move on now to a panel discussion on net zero, the challenges and opportunities, where our next guest will take a look at prioritizing sustainability and climate change, the net zero carbon buildings commitment, and PPP collaboration towards effective design and construction. And also, by the way, on behalf of the Big Five team, we would like to say a huge congratulations to Egypt ahead of hosting COP27 next year, and of course, to the United Arab Emirates ahead of the Emirates hosting COP28 in 2023. A huge congratulations once again. In the meantime, please do join me in welcoming our panelists for this next session. First up, we have Mina Hasman, Associate Director, Sustainability Lead at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill Europe. We also have Megan White, Chief Sustainability Officer at Integral Group, and Tushant Suri, Head of Sustainable Design and Energy at Multiplex. And now to lead the conversation, please do welcome your moderator, Matthew Black, Project Officer at the Advancing Net Zero Project at the World Green Buildings Council.
Thank you, Laura, for the introductions. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the Big Five Online Reconnect sessions. My name is Matthew Black, and I'm the Project Coordinator for Advancing Net Zero at the World Green Building Council. World GBC catalyzes the uptake of sustainable buildings for everyone, everywhere. We're transforming the building and construction sector across three strategic areas: climate action, health and well-being, and resources and circularity. We're a global network of over 70 individual green building councils around the globe. Today's session that you've joined us for is titled Net Zero, Opportunities and Challenges. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests for today's session. Our first guest is Mina Hasman, Associate Director at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Mina leads SOM's sustainability and well-being daily operations and long-term vision for achieving excellence in practice. She also leads SOM's engagement with World GBC on their net zero carbon buildings commitment. She has experience in a wide variety of projects in Europe, the UK, the Middle East and beyond, bringing a fantastic understanding of the implications for sustainable and equitable design in different climatic, social and regulatory contexts. Hi, Mina.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. Our second guest is Megan White, Chief Sustainability Officer at Integral Group. Megan is responsible for applying the same levels of ambition and performance from Integral's project work to their local and global initiatives, such as World GBC's Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. She leads the delivery of Integral's annual Corporate and Social Environmental Responsibility Report and works with leading global organizations to develop and implement transformative sustainability and wellness strategies. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you, Matt, so much. It's great to be here.
Fantastic to have you. And last but not least, our third guest is Tushant Suri, Head of Sustainable Design and Energy at Multiplex. Tushant has been involved in a variety of sustainable design and construction projects throughout his time at Multiplex, with a focus on the Middle East and India, including the first LEED Platinum mall in the Middle East. In his current role, Tushant leads Multiplex's efforts on sustainable design and energy across their business. Welcome, Tushant.
Hi, I'm Tushant Suri, Head of Sustainable Design and Energy for Multiplex Europe. And I'm looking forward to this panel discussion at the Big Five event.
So before we get into our questions today, I'm going to give a little bit of an opening and set the scene for our discussion. Buildings are responsible for almost 40% of global energy-related carbon emissions and 50% of all extracted materials. The building and construction sector's demand on natural resources accelerates climate change, and inefficient, unhealthy buildings negatively impact human health and well-being. To limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, as set out within the Paris Agreement, World GBC and our collaborators are playing a leading role in the Building to COP26 coalition. Together with leading NGOs and organizations, we are calling for emissions from building projects globally to be halved by 2030 and to reach net zero life cycle emissions for all buildings no later than 2050. As operational carbon is reduced, embodied carbon will continue to grow in importance as a proportion of total emissions. Whilst we must continue to focus on addressing operational carbon, we must now rapidly increase efforts to tackle embodied carbon emissions at a global scale too. For the built environment, this means we must use all of the tools at our disposal in the right ways to transition towards net zero carbon, healthy, equitable, and a resilient built environment as soon as possible in order to meet this goal. In the aftermath of COP26, we need to catalyze and continue deep collaboration in our efforts. We must work together now to halve the built environment emissions by 2030 and establish the built environment as a major solution provider to the climate crisis. But that's enough from me. Let's hear from our panelists on the opportunities and challenges of net zero. So on to our first question today. How important is the role of the built environment in tackling the climate crisis? And more on that, what opportunity is there for buildings themselves to act as a critical climate solution? Mina, if I could come to you first for your thoughts on that question.
Of course, thank you for that question, Matt. I think as you've emphasized, the built environment has a significant responsibility in addressing climate crisis and actually a great opportunity for it to become a part of the solution. As a key actor along the built environment value chain, as a designer, I surely feel the responsibility of the decisions I'm taking today because I'm well aware that they will have an impact for decades and if not generations to come. And I think acknowledging our role as designers, especially within the framework of SOM, where we work in an interdisciplinary manner, we're able to look at the solutions from a sort of multidisciplinary perspective and understanding also different contexts and the realities of different conditions will demand our responses to be much more agile and adaptable in any part of the world that we're offering. And I think one way that the built environment can become a part of the solution is first and foremost is not to emit carbon, and if I may even dare to say, by absorbing carbon. So we really need to leverage the built environments to be vehicles to absorb the carbon from the atmosphere while also providing the right conditions and environments for the communities and for the people that will occupy them. And I'm making a bold statement here saying that the built environment should sequester and absorb carbon, but I really believe this is what the future will look like because we would inevitably need new buildings and or renovation of existing buildings to accommodate the population growth globally all around the world. And we need to really carefully work together in a cross-disciplinary and cross-collaborative manner to draw the intelligent to couple intelligently various existing and emerging systems as well as technologies to deliver not only net zero but also beyond net zero carbon negative built environments, because this will be the only way we can really help globally decarbonize the entire sector.
Excellent. Thank you, Mina. I think you've hit on a really important point there in terms of the opportunity, as we're discussing, of buildings to fulfill that role, to go even beyond net zero, to be regenerative and to contribute to that resilience that we need moving forwards into the future. Megan, maybe I can come to you for some thoughts.
Yeah, and thank you, Mina, so much for that. It was just so well articulated. We've been thinking a lot about buildings and the role that they play in this greater climate crisis. And it's really within Integral Group, and Integral Group is part of a larger organization, the DAR Group, and coming together with all of our brother and sister organizations, we've really been thinking about what it means to expand our understanding of the built environment, not just about buildings alone, but the horizontal infrastructure. And so recently we just released this report in partnership with the World Green Building Council called Beyond Buildings. And what we started to realize through that research was that buildings themselves may account for 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But when you start to look at the infrastructure sector, and its role in that, we start to raise that number up to 70% even. And so there's something that's really interesting here. We see a huge opportunity, as we look at our supply chains, as we look at those materials, Matt, as you alluded to, as we address the operating emissions and start to bring operations down to net zero, if not absolute zero, and not just from an annual basis, but from an actual real-time hourly basis, this trend towards 24/7 carbon-free energy. And really being able to manage our energy on when that energy is being leveraged and used, so those emissions aren't happening in the first place. And then we start to look at this embodied carbon sector, and there is a real opportunity. The supply chain for horizontal infrastructure in the built environment and in vertical buildings is the same supply chain. And we really see this as an opportunity when we bring these two worlds together and decouple the silos, that we're going to really be able to unlock the circular economy. And so when these all pieces come together, when we start to talk about the built environment through the lens and sector of carbon, it's also going to support us globally with respect to health and well-being of people, as well as reduction of waste. And so that's what we're really excited about. It's complex. But we know as leaders in this industry, we need to dive into the complexities in all of this. And really start to unravel it and use big data to our benefit to strategize and find the best solutions.
Absolutely, Megan. It's definitely not an easy task, but hopefully all of us here on the call are up for the challenge. You mentioned some fantastic points about, even looking beyond buildings to the wider built environment ecosystem. It's all very well if one individual building is functioning in net zero, but if, our energy systems, our transport systems, all of the above aren't also contributing to that overall reduction of emissions, then we're not having those different parts of the ecosystem talk to each other. And I think, you referenced beyond buildings there. That's a great sort of entry point, I think, for people to understand that relationship between infrastructure and buildings in more detail. We can come to Tushant for some of your thoughts. And Tushant, maybe you can speak about, Multiplex are involved in actually building the buildings that SOM and Integral are involved in helping to design. Maybe you can give us some thoughts about how Multiplex look towards buildings as a climate solution and your role within that life cycle.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. Very important question for the industry, and a very good question. So thank you. The first part of the question, yes, we look at buildings as a perfect climate solution. I think there are multiple research which has been published now, which confirms that existing real estate, especially the one which has been constructed and commissioned in the pre-2000 era, contributes to almost more than 65% of the global real estate footprint. So when we look at deep retrofits, definitely buildings are a key aspect of the climate solution. Secondly, we all are aware the real estate sector contributes to more than 38% of the overall global carbon footprint. And there's a huge opportunity for the sector to work towards mitigating the impact of climate change and aligning with the climate science of 1.5 degrees. Thirdly, the second aspect of the question now is where we see ourselves sitting in as contractors and principal contractors. Fundamentally and traditionally, contractors have been involved on a stage 4 or a stage 5, which is during detailed design development or upon completion of design development. I think there's an opportunity for us to take a step back, get involved with the client, with the designers, and with the value chain, with the entire supply chain on a concept design to understand how together as a team we can combat climate change and enhance asset value in the long run.
Fantastic. Well, we've heard from all of our guests here today on how buildings can act as a climate solution. I want to move on now to our second question, where we're looking at the importance of highlighting whole life carbon, and specifically embodied carbon in relation to the emissions from the built environment. Now, I alluded to this a little bit in the introduction, and we spoke a little bit in the last question about how we're moving from focusing on operational emissions, which are still extremely significant, but starting to broaden our action to include tackling embodied carbon. So, Megan, maybe I can come to you first and give us a little bit about the importance of embodied carbon within the built environment.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. We were just so supportive of the World Green Building Council in its transition to a whole life carbon vision. It's something within our research at Integral Group that really started to reveal itself as we were diving into research on embodied carbon itself. And I want to allude to, one of our first research papers that actually was coming out almost 5 years ago, as we were diving into, how can you actually measure the potential savings of reusing existing buildings? And so when we dove in and look at the embodied carbon analysis of an existing building built for reuse that was designed to net positive energy, and incorporate even the embodied carbon of the additional structural elements necessary to uphold new renewables on the roof and the embodied carbon of those renewables themselves, what we ended up finding as a result is that the embodied carbon saved through this entire process was 70%. And that was far more than what we had hypothesized, and really revealing. And I think it really points to the critical piece of this giant puzzle that we're all trying to solve, is how important existing buildings are as a solution. And so when we're going to build new, if we must build new, it's really critical and important that we're doing so in the selection of low embodied carbon material solutions, as well as going to net zero operations immediately. And we need those leaders that are going to do it before 2030, with 2030 being our end point. And then as we were diving into this whole life carbon analysis, we took this same project. And at the time, 5 years ago, we didn't understand what is the actual embodied carbon of the MEP building systems, the mechanical systems, the electrical systems. It was so much information that was just a complete unknown. And since then, we dove really deep into this analysis. And what we found is that depending on the systems that are selected, we originally held like 10% of the total carbon footprint is in the MEP systems. That was a big guesstimate at that point. And as we dove into the research and we did the manufacturer outreach and we did the vetting, depending on the systems, that could be as low as 10%, but it could be as high as 30 to 50%. And a lot of that depends on the systems that are selected and specifically the refrigerants. So what we really appreciate about a whole life carbon vision is embedding the analysis of embodied and operations with refrigerants and understanding the potential of refrigerant leakage. Because this is what we found through our research in one area where we could go potentially very wrong. And so the more that we continue to do case studies, the more that we continue to do research, the more that we continue to understand whole life carbon and whole life carbon analysis, it's going to continue to inform us on design.
Absolutely. I think that's a really key point there. We're all on a journey at the moment. I think the whole industry is on a journey. We're all learning about embodied carbon. I think week by week, there's more case studies, there's more data. And, the more we have of all of the above, the better we understand and the better that we can provide those solutions, through your work, through design. Mina, maybe I can take some thoughts from you, SOM as an architect, as a design firm. How do you come at your role as a stakeholder within a building life cycle to tackle embodied and whole life emissions more generally?
Thank you, Matt. And it's great to hear Megan also to talk about data and the importance of existing buildings and the sort of the data that is being gathered specifically around the impact that MEP systems have, which is something that not many have been looking at across the sort of sector over the years. We've been very much focused on minimizing impact on structures and sort of architectural components, but we with the data that is gathered by Integral Group and others, there's a great evidence shown the importance of addressing MEP systems as well as architecture and structural components. So I just wanted to highlight that. I'm very thankful for Megan mentioning that. But I think going back to your question, Matt, it's maybe working at SOM is actually making me feel even much more responsible for the decisions we're taking as designers for the future to enable the built environments to be a part of the solution of the climate crisis, is because we work almost in every country around the world and every scale. So there is a huge opportunity, but also a challenge that we're facing because the contexts are so different. So the solutions we're offering are not one size fits all. They all require rigorous research, evaluation, and iterative process to enable us to curate and refine the solutions we're offering for a unique context. And I think especially embodied carbon in this picture is really important one to highlight, because embodied carbon, and also again, considering the projects that I work on typically, which take about 6.5, 7 years from the day of inception to construction completion, the decisions I'm taking today are probably going to be what this decade is going to demonstrate as a solution in the decarbonization journey. So it's really important that the decisions I am taking, or individuals such as myself, who work in very complex and large-scale projects that take time to make the right choices as early as day one, because those decisions are actually defining what the emissions will be within this decade, and if not decades to come. So the emissions are being locked in the decisions that we're taking today. So I think it's really important to perhaps to highlight the need to curate and refine the solutions for reducing embodied carbon and in general whole life carbon, as well as operational carbon for various contexts around the world, and also not to forget that we are against the time, sort of the challenge of time and the scale of the impact that we need to deliver. And for it to be effectively, I think, offering a solution, we really need to work with every key stakeholder and actor along the value chain, because we alone as designers will never be able to get there. So it's really important to acknowledge our role within the value chain, but also encourage collaboration so that we can collectively get there faster and at scale.
Thank you, Mina. I think, collaboration. It's such a key point. I think, off the back of COP26 last week, we've seen a lot of collaboration, but inevitably we need more. We need, exactly like you said, Mina, all of the different stakeholders, whether you're a design firm, an architect, a developer, a constructor, or even a client, you need to be playing your part to be setting those specifications, to reduce the embodied as much as possible, be lean, be efficient in your design, and exactly that, collaborate to produce the best buildings that we can to ensure that we're on track for that 1.5 degree scenario. Tushant, again, as representing Multiplex, as the constructor in the room, you play a key role. The design comes to you, and then you've got to build it. So, how do you approach your efforts in terms of, reducing whole life and embodied within the projects that you work on?
Thank you. There's a pretty prescriptive approach or a roadmap. However, it's bespoke to each project because every project is unique in its own way. So firstly, from an embodied carbon perspective, our first intent is to eliminate demolition if there's an existing structure in place, which means we conduct a pre-demolition audit to understand if we can retain the structure, we can retain the facade, we can retain the piles, fundamentally reduce the concrete and steel volumes which are used into the project. The second aspect is revalidating the design, reducing any over-design elements or aspects. And the third is collaborating with the supply chain to understand and explore alternate materials. In order to make our vision reality, I think there's a pretty clear directive in Multiplex that we believe actions speak louder than words, is and to convert all these words into real actions, real case studies. We're one of the first signatories to Steel Zero commitment. We were one of the first signatories to Concrete Zero commitment. And what this enables us to do is send aggregated demand signals to the manufacturers outlining the key and an urgent demand for low carbon materials. So that's the embodied carbon aspect. From an operational carbon perspective, it's again revalidating the design, understanding and exploring low carbon technologies. What we're also doing is collaborating with multiple ESCOs for off-balance sheet procurement tools and routes. And thirdly is leveraging a unique relationship with Brookfield Renewables to reduce the EOI, and then the residual EOI is gated through a renewable energy PPA, potentially with additionality, to eliminate the carbon footprint through the life cycle of operations of the asset.
Wonderful. Really insightful there, Tushant. Thank you very much. So on to our next question. We're going to talk about World GBC's net zero carbon buildings commitment. So for those of you who may not know what the commitment is, World GBC runs a climate initiative that challenges businesses, cities, regions, and substates to achieve net zero operational emissions for the assets that they own, and to achieve maximum reductions in embodied carbon for any new developments or major renovations that they undertake from 2030 onwards. So what we want to know is, how important is this initiative for the built environment, and specifically for each of you on the call here as signatories to the commitment? How has it informed your business's decarbonisation efforts, and has it been, I hope it has been, a positive influence? Megan, maybe we come to you first.
Yeah, sure, Matt. Thank you so much. And, you made a comment earlier about the role that each one of us plays as, designers, engineers, architects, contractors. We all play a unique individual role, developers as well, obviously, policymakers. And when it came time to reviewing the net zero carbon buildings commitment, which was launched back in 2018, Integral Group became a founding signatory. It was an immediate yes for us because we understood the importance of a commitment like this in signaling the market to transform. And so upon signing on, it's always one of those things. We don't have the answers. We don't know how we're going to get there, but we're a big yes to it, and we will figure it out. And that's been such a beautiful journey that we have been on. And I think there's such a huge opportunity for so many of us within the industry to take that leap of faith and to make these kinds of commitments and be there to support one another on that journey, this collaboration that you've referred to. Because we're really all in it together. And so by being on that leading front and that leading edge, my phone rings all the time, from folks that are interested in the commitment and want to understand the commitment and how do you tackle some of these aspects and pieces, these nuances that maybe are misunderstood. And so really trying to help break the commitment down and help folks understand that it's actually not as difficult as it might seem at first. It is quite feasible and quite doable. And what we've seen in this time period, over the course of the last 3 years on this journey, is the market shifting dramatically. The market of the ESG market, driven by our investors, and this transition. It's if you're not a part of some kind of carbon commitment today, you're actually being left behind. And so this is really critical for us. And being a part of this and talking to folks has been just so powerful, to the point where we're so excited for all those that are joining us on this commitment. And I alluded to earlier, Integral Group is part of a larger family. And we're so excited that the DAR Group and all of the brother and sister organizations within the DAR Group signed on to the World Green Building Council Net Zero Carbons Building Commitment on the onset of this new whole life carbon vision. And so what that did is our influence as an organization, we're a global organization. organization with 700 employees, but we just brought on an even larger global organization with 17,000 employees. And that many assets and that many more individuals that are getting a grasp and understanding this and not just influencing our assets as professional services companies, but the role that we play on all of those projects and all the advocacy projects that come along with a commitment. So it's not just our footprint, but it's the handprint, it's the projects that we all touch in being part of the greater solution. So each one of us really is just a pebble in the ocean, and we have this opportunity to make a massive ripple effect. And that's what the commitment means to us. So we're just really excited to be a part of it and continue to help support anyone who is interested in getting started and helping to unlock, the ins and outs and the details of what that actually really means to implement.
Thank you, Megan. I think, that's such a key point. The commitment in first and foremost is about, influencing the assets that you have direct control over. What can you do to bring your buildings towards net zero and accelerate that market transformation? But beyond that, you hit the nail on the head. We've already talked about collaboration, and we really ask signatories to explore how they can advocate throughout across their business and influence their supply chains, their customers and beyond, so that we create a platform and a sort of a real cohort of industry leaders who are all collaborating together and accelerating that market transformation. Because you're exactly right. If we're sat in our own silos, we're not going to achieve that massive change that we need. Tushant, maybe you could give us some thoughts on Multiplex's involvement in the commitment and specifically your recent strategy, 1 Decade to Act.
Yes, thank you, Matt. 1 Decade to Act is our net zero carbon pathway, which outlines 5 key targets for Multiplex Europe. Target 1 is zero site emissions by 2025. We're not saying net zero. We're iterating on zero emissions on site by 2025. Though our Scope 1 emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions contribute to less than 2% of our carbon footprint, but we have a direct control and influence on these. And thus, that's one of the most ambitious targets for us as part of 1 Decade to Act. Goal 2 is 50% reduction in embodied carbon intensity by 2030. Goal 3 is net zero building operations by 2030. Goal number 4 is zero emissions from transport by 2030. And goal 5 is zero avoidable waste by 2030. They're extremely ambitious targets. And one of the key aspects of 1 Decade to Act is also our cultural change program. At Multiplex, we recognize, Matt, that we do not have all the answers, and we cannot combat climate change alone. And thus, 3 key elements of our cultural change program that stemmed out of 1 Decade to Act are educate, engage, and empower. That is, educating our supply chain, our people, empowering, again, our supply chain and our people, and engaging with the entire value chain as early in design as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Tushant. And finally, Mina, to you and SOM, how have you experienced the commitment, and what sort of influence has it had on SOM in terms of your business activities?
Thank you, Matt. I think I cannot iterate enough how important this commitment has been for us. It actually just solidified our actions and our sort of initiatives and thinking that we have been progressing across the firm over a decade, I would say, but it has solidified and made us much more focused to prioritize our actions and activities within the assets we have within our direct control. But I also want to sort of congratulate World Green Building Council on putting out such an important initiative and commitment because of, I think, 3 main reasons. And this is my plea for others to join this commitment in this process, if I may say it this way, is because it really raises awareness and streamlines the knowledge, the level of knowledge that exists once a company joins this commitment. So now we're almost 1,100 strong across the firm, around 10 different offices around the world, where we all have the same level of awareness and knowledge about our implications and the impact that our offices and our office operations have on the climate journey, on the climate, and I'm going to say it positively, on the climate journey. So it is really important. That's one key aspect that the commitment is bringing, is just raising this level of awareness and streamlining the knowledge across the signatories. And also it mobilizes all actors along the value chain. I think that's why I applaud this commitment, because it really shines a light on the responsibility that different actors have along the value chain. And even though there is a signatory, and we as a signatory come into play here, we acknowledge that for example, the electricity supply to our offices is beyond our control, but it's an opportunity for us to help inform and influence our landlords, because we're tenants in our offices, to help inform and influence our landlords' decisions and actions that they're taking, is sort of indirectly by being a signatory to this commitment. And this has been I think the biggest impact we've seen over the last few years that we've been a part of this commitment, that we have been able to influence others beyond our direct control. And I also should emphasize the need of a commitment such as this one. I'm very thankful for it to be here, because it really creates this the market transformation that we already are seeing by creating this demand over the last years, because we've been asking, taking advantage of our position across the globe in 10 different countries, in 10 different offices, where we are able to demand the same within our sort of local markets, or for example, needing the electricity supply to our offices to be from renewable sources. And that demand is generating market transformation, even to a smaller extent within the localities of our offices. So hopefully we will see much more of this ripple effect that Megan had touched upon before, by being a part of this commitment. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for your kind words, Mina. And I'm definitely going to repeat that call to action that you said, and encourage everyone, if you're a representative of your business, to check out the World Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. Go to our website, find out more, and we'd love to welcome you into that cohort of leaders taking action within the built environment. So I want to go now to a bit of a global perspective and sort of understand what regions are doing compared to others. And specifically, considering the session that we're participating today, what can the Middle East and Africa learn from the rest of the world in terms of the opportunity of net zero? Now, Tushant, I know you've done a lot of work for Multiplex in the Middle East, so perhaps we can get your thoughts on the opportunities of net zero in the region.
One of the key aspects of Middle East is abundance of availability of space, and it's a land of the rising sun, which makes a perfect business case to install on-site renewable energies and solar. Having said that, I think the Middle East and the African region, or the MENA region, has been on the journey of decarbonization. We've seen a climate pledge coming out of Saudi to achieve net zero by 2060 early this week. They have been on the journey, firstly. Secondly, I think from a lessons learned perspective, one of the key aspects towards decarbonization of real estate, especially associated with building operations, is bridging the scope gap. We've seen best practices stemming out of Australia, which was Neighbours Australia. Towards the tail end of last year, we saw Neighbours UK being released, fundamentally focusing on bridging the performance gap. I think that's one element that the Middle East and the African region can look at. Secondly, is understanding the regional demands, the end user needs, from a thermal comfort perspective, from an occupant need perspective, and thirdly, the end user decarbonization strategies. There's a huge opportunity to optimize the envelope, the facade in the Middle East region, the kind of window to wall ratios that we see in the Middle East. Maybe there's an opportunity to reduce that, which fundamentally would enable reducing the embodied carbon and operational carbon through the life cycle of the assets. So summarizing the three key aspects: leveraging on the climate and the right land at the shining sun. Secondly, looking at bridging the performance gap, especially from an energy perspective. And thirdly, I would say looking at optimizing the design, eliminating any over-design elements that exist.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tushant. And now to Megan and Mina again, both Integral and SOM work on projects within the region. You're both global companies. Perhaps you can give a little bit of perspective on what the opportunity is in the Middle East in terms of net zero. Mina, you first.
Thank you, Matt, for that question. I think there is a great opportunity in the Middle East to advance the net zero agenda, specifically because Middle East represents a very harsh climatic condition, but also that challenges us to innovate when we talk about net zero solutions. And for that reason, I see that as an opportunity that we're continuously embracing in the projects that we work with in the Middle East. And there's also a greater opportunity to perhaps not only innovate, but also influence sort of new standards, because there are a lot of perhaps in Europe and in the States where we mostly operate, we see a lot of those standards and sort of benchmarks defined by the industry, by the regulations and so forth. And in the Middle East, there's an opportunity to help inform new standards and new benchmarks in that region, because there isn't that longer history as it exists in Europe and the United States, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, Mina, that, the rest of the world can also learn from that innovation happening in the Middle East and Africa. It's such a fertile ground for net zero and working from that point, harnessing, you mentioned the harsh climatic conditions, but really, turning that to an advantage, what can be done to really use that to play into, increase energy production and so on. Megan, your thoughts?
I feel like I want to just echo so much of what Mina said. I mean, the opportunity for innovation here and really embodying and embracing circular-based systems at this more kind of district level scale seems to be a real opportunity and solution that this region can really shine and teach so much of the rest of the world on how we can accelerate those solutions at these scales, and the microgrids and the renewable grid, and moving away from fossil fuels and towards renewables as our resource and solutions. And it just thinks so much too about the journey that we're going to be on and the conversations that we're having today, and just trying to provide a little bit of foresight into where the world is going to be going over the next decade and multiple decades, and thinking about water and the role that water is going to play as we continue to move forward, and how our solutions need to really embrace these circular based water systems, net zero water solutions as well. And so I see a real opportunity in these regions to lead on those efforts. And so much to learn through that. And I just think, too, there's a real opportunity. We're learning so much as we continue to dive in and understand our supply chains around the world. And, not just the embodied carbon of our supply chains and those materials, but how do we equitably source these materials from all parts of the world. And I think that there's really something here that we need to be in greater partnership and understanding on how these materials are resourced, because so many of those resources are coming from these regions. And so I'm just really excited to continue to learn from the innovation that I believe will take place here.
I think that's a fantastic point to end on. And I'm going to come to our last question. And if I could ask our panelists to be brief, maybe just one sentence to conclude our answers for today. So COP26 concluded last week. And what I want to know is, what do the panelists want to see as a future outcome of our collaboration and work that will galvanize both the public and private sector? And how can we accelerate that action towards collaboratively advancing net zero? Megan.
I think my top desired outcome is that we're going to transition more towards absolute zero carbon, not just a net zero carbon solution. We know that net zero is necessary right now as a solution, but we need to transition our entire market and industry towards real reductions.
Excellent. And Tushant, your one final thought.
Thank you, Matt. That's a really good question. We all are keeping a very close eye on COP26 and are really excited to see what stems out of it. But I think there's already market demand signal coming in. The Net Zero Investors Alliance being released their 2030, 2050 targets. There's also, I think the insurance sector needs to come on the journey and start accepting low carbon solutions, which are a bit innovative. They would be used for the first of the time, but I think the insurance sector needs to give the opportunity to start utilizing these low carbon techs. Thirdly, I would say the legislation evolution being catalyzed and catapulted post COP26, especially the new UNEP report being released. It again is suggesting that the climate pledges are not enough to decarbonize the world and align with the climate science of 1.5 degrees C. The current targets established by multiple countries across the globe are not enough. At least the interim or the midterm 2030 targets are not ambitious enough. So we foresee the legislation being catalyzed and catapulted at the onset of COP26.
Wonderful. And Mina, finally, your thoughts to end the session.
Thank you, Matt. I just hope that there will be a greater data collection and sharing across the world and all of our buildings, both existing and future emerging ones, because without data, we're simply blind and never really be able to have the opportunity to learn from our mistakes, but also to innovate. And we desperately need innovation to advance the decarbonization journey in many parts around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mina. So I think I'm going to say thank you to Mina, Megan, and Tushant for a wonderful discussion. I think in light of this fantastic momentum that we're seeing after COP26, it's more important than ever to prioritize the built environment, as we've discussed, as a critical climate solution. And within this, as we've discussed, it's important that whole life carbon is central in these plans to achieving a 1.5 degree future. And I think the audience will join me in saying that, I'm inspired by the leadership and ambition showed by our speakers and their respective businesses today. And I want to thank them again for their time and their valuable contributions. And finally, to thank the Big Five Reconnect for hosting us. And I think we can now move on to questions and answers from our audience.
Well, a brilliant session, that one, on net zero opportunities and challenges. And thank you so much to Matthew Black for moderating so brilliantly as well. Sadly, Mina and Megan have had to leave. They're not going to be joining us for Q&A. But of course, we do have Tushant and Matthew here to answer your questions. And we have quite a few that have come in fact. The first one, now it was highlighted that analysis, of course, is very important for future design. So Tushant, what is the effect of external facades, especially glass, on sustainability and climate change? That was the first question that's come in for you.
Thanks, Laura. I think sustainability, energy efficiency, low carbon businesses, operations, the phenomena is going through an evolution, which is super exciting. When I joined the industry 8 years back, the focus was maximizing the efficiency of the glass, subsequently reducing your mechanical loads and resulting energy consumption during the life cycle of operations. But now, with embodied carbon, and our learning and our understanding of the impact of embodied carbon has evolved since then, and it's fundamentally optimizing the design. Rather than just having a very one-dimensional approach. I think looking at glass alone would be a bit unfair. It's looking at the development holistically throughout the life cycle of carbon, cost perspective, and making informed decisions. So yeah, glass definitely plays a key role, but when it comes to optimization, you've got to look at it from a whole life cycle carbon lens rather than just a design lens.
I mean, as you said, the market really is shifting. So for existing buildings, how can they be more compliant to becoming more green building by minimizing rebuild? That was the next question that's come in. How can existing buildings become more green by minimizing rebuild?
I am absolutely passionate about this. This is exactly where the world is transitioning to. Fundamentally, and traditionally, I think concrete steel structures generally have a life cycle of 70, 80 years. With minor tweaks, you can span it up to another 20, 25 years. And thus, coming down, demolishing buildings which are 30, 35 years old to ground zero, and then reconstructing it just doesn't align with the carbon science anymore. Which means that there's definitely opportunity for the entire value chain to collaborate, the engineers to come on the forefront, go through deep retrofit of assets, because it's not a function of just carbon. I think what the pandemic has made us realize is that at least 80 to 85% of our times are spent indoors. Now, that can be an office, that can be home, that can be the gym, it can be a restaurant, but it is indoors. And thus, it's also understanding and maximizing the impact of built environment on the well-being of the occupants. And I think as the well-being and the carbon aspect comes together, the future is deep retrofitting, where we also look at collaborating with ESCOs, looking at off-balance sheet debt, product as a service model, where you've retrofitted, engineered the building, and then you have an assured team of experts who will help us, enable us, ensuring that the building performs exactly how it's supposed to and limits the performance gap.
Well, Matt, this one has come in for you. This next one's for you. Is the World Green Building Council or any other organisation working towards the standardisation of the net zero concept based on the volume or type of the projects?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. And thanks for that question. I think that's an extremely difficult one. I think as an industry, we're all trying to work towards a clearer understanding of net zero, bringing together data standards, harmonizing them as much as possible. In saying that, I don't think there is one answer. The route and the path to achieving net zero is going to be extremely difficult. They're different if you're building or retrofitting a building in Northern Europe as compared to the Middle East or Asia or Latin America. And so we have to be a little bit careful on that. But of course, there's more that we can do to make this process as easy as possible. There are rating tools across the world that will help people both within the design of their building and during the construction to ensure that its performance matches what they set out to achieve. And I think really through these, and it's another word that we mentioned a lot during the discussion, but collaboration. We need this collaboration between all stakeholders within the buildings and construction industry to achieve that harmonization. It doesn't just work if engineers decide that this is the thing that we want to achieve, and then a construction company comes along and says, well we can't do that, or the architects have designed a wonderful building, but it doesn't work in practice. So really, again, I'm just going to highlight that collaboration and ensuring that these stakeholders work together so that we are really looking to achieve net zero and healthy, resilient buildings everywhere we can.
Well, that leads very nicely into the next question, actually, which is what are the key decisions that we can make when it comes to reducing pollution in a working environment? What do you think the key decisions are that we can make?
Sorry, Laura, if that was to me, my audio dropped for a second, so I wonder if you could repeat the question.
This is for both of you as well, if anyone wants to chip in. But what are the key decisions, do you think, that we can make when it comes to reducing pollution in a working environment?
I'm happy to go first quickly. I think, in a working environment, if we're talking about the buildings and the assets that we occupy when we're working, the key thing is, looking at operational emissions. So ensuring that the building is running as efficiently as possible. This may need retrofitting to some degree, as Tushant highlighted, in order to make that building function as best as it can. And then really we should just look to minimize where possible. So not have any unnecessary appliances or building systems running when the building isn't occupied. And then, as we discussed previously in the discussion just now, the other side is embodied carbon. But really that's for, like we discussed, the engineers and the construction teams and the stakeholders to focus on as assets are being developed or retrofitted. It's not necessarily something that individuals can influence whilst they're at work day to day.
Well, very quickly, Tushant, how do you see retrofit developing in specifically the Middle East region then?
I've worked in that region for 7 years, and the potential is immense. The Middle East, especially the UAE and even Qatar, but fundamentally UAE went through a mega development spree pretty much 20 years back. So we saw the entire trade center pocket being developed, the JBR, the Marina, and the Abu Dhabi Corniche. Those buildings need an upskilling, not purely from a carbon perspective, but even from an IT perspective. We're transitioning into an age of 5G, and the smart infrastructure in these buildings needs to be upgraded. From a carbon point of view, definitely. From an operational cost perspective, there's a huge opportunity. So we have two options now: either to bring these buildings down to a ground zero, which would be unfair from a resource utilization and maximization point of view. And the second is to go through a deep retrofit. So the market gap is huge. I think there was a report published by the IFC or the World Bank, if I'm not wrong. And to give this a perspective, the retrofit market is expected to explode to a $25 trillion mark in the next 10 to 12 years. So that number in itself speaks louder than anything else.
And well, there's a question here on big data, actually. How can we further reduce carbon emissions with the help of big data?
Data is key, especially for us millennials. We all are riding on a very evidence-based decision-making approach. I think it's across our lives. We're now wearing smartwatches, tracking our lives, looking at our screen times of our phones. So we are transitioning to a very data-enabled world by default. Real estate, fundamentally, traditionally, data hasn't played a huge role. It's been a very experience-driven industry, but the change is around the corner. It becomes more vital to start leveraging data to make decision-making, and also start building data warehouses, one for the supply chain, and second, from a developer's point of view, for the assets that you own and you're in process of developing. What you develop now will need to be refurbed in 15 to 20 years. That's what we're learning. And we don't want to encounter that scenario again, that you want to refurb a building, but you just don't have all the set of drawings, or they've got misplaced, or they have not been updated. So big data, digital twins needs to be embedded in the real estate sector, and it's happening.
Well, there's also another very good question that's come in surrounding cost, because obviously in theory, this is, the way forward, and a more sort of sustainable outlook is the way ahead. But what about cost? So if recyclable material is available but at a higher cost, why should project owners approve this?
I'm happy to jump in there quickly. First of all, I think I'd like to challenge that overall and a little bit. I think there's an awful lot of research these days, an awful lot of reports that would challenge that and say that working towards or achieving a net zero building does not necessarily mean an increased cost. Of course, there are premiums to be paid for recycled materials or things that may not have as much availability. But one of the things that I think we should really shift our understanding of here is, judging things on purely just a financial cost, as opposed to, thinking holistically, as Tushant has said, and perhaps even thinking of the carbon cost of the building. All of the choices made to bring a new asset to market or to retrofit a building have a resulting carbon cost. And when you're making those decisions, we are at the point now where it cannot just be a financial choice. And responsible developers need to be making choices that actively reflect this and achieving the maximum reductions of emissions possible. Otherwise, we're not going to be on track as an industry, as a planet, as a species, to achieve that 1.5 degree scenario outlined in the Paris Agreement.
And Laura, if I can add to Matt's point, it's absolutely right. And I think there's also a key aspect of understanding the risk of assets getting stranded. What that means is that as the legislation around carbon keeps on increasing, assets will need to be upscaled, or there will be a tipping point where instead of asset valuation going up, it starts dropping because it does not align with the legislative requirements. So I think it's sustainability. I'm genuinely passionate and I'm loving it, is that it's gone way beyond purely a case of saving the world. There's a huge opportunity. There's a strong business case now associated with low carbon businesses, net zero buildings, etc. So I don't think, if you look at it from a developer's lens, spending a percent or exponentially less than that of their development and asset cost on recycled materials would be seen as a cost uplift. It's fundamentally enhancing the asset resilience in the long run.
Absolutely. And just one more final point, if I can, building on what Tushant said there, I'm going to do a little plug. And last week at the end of COP, World GBC released a new report called Beyond the Business Case. And this is really exactly an answer to that question. It's looking at beyond the purely financial and to the holistic benefits that sort of sustainable net zero resilient buildings can bring to all of us. So if you're looking for more answers, do go check that out.
And it's always to do with the long-term outlook, isn't it? So that's definitely the way forward. Let's talk about COP26 for a moment. Are you all happy with the pledges and commitments and outcomes so far? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll let Matt take this first.
Well, listen, overall, I think it was good. I think it is always beneficial to get these world leaders, these industry leaders. I think it's really important to highlight that this COP, more than ever before, had a real presence from the private sector. And whether people like that or not, these people are pushing the boundaries and almost, more often than not, pushing the policymakers to show them what is possible and to show them that they're not afraid of further regulation. And so we have these leaders who are pushing and hopefully bring the mainstream along with them. In terms of COP overall, yeah, I do think it was a good result. And specifically in terms of the built environment, there was an awful lot of content for the built environment. We had our first built environment focused day since the Paris COP 6 years ago. And within that, there was an awful lot of announcements, a massive increase in nationally determined contributions, specifically mentioning energy efficiency in buildings, a massive increase in commitments from the private sector, including 44 organizations signed up to the updated net zero carbon buildings commitment, which includes action on embodied carbon and taking a whole life carbon approach. And so really, I think we can take heart from that. And ultimately, as it always is with these things, we've got to build on it. We've got to take that momentum. More people need to make commitments. And more importantly than making a commitment, we need to see the action behind it.
Tushant, do you want to take over?
Matt summarized it perfectly. I think on a personal front for me, the two key takeaways from COP26, one, especially, and this is very built environment focus, is that it's the first time that we're saying that the private sector is actually leading the way and the legislation is following. which purely echoes the strong business case, the opportunities that the sector sees with decarbonization. So that was one. And the second was the fact that the quantum of momentum that it's got up, it's made it pretty clear, either you're on the journey or you're not on the journey. It's pretty much eradicated a gray spot for businesses, for individuals, for cities, for countries. So yeah, those were the two key takeaways for me. It's on the momentum. We have to do it. Being on the journey is purely not an option. It's purely a function of how soon you get onto it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tushant, Suri, and Matthew Black. Thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your time with us and insights so openly as well. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, audience.
Many
Cheers.
thanks.
Bye.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, our next session is going to be at 3:45, Gulf Standard Time, that is, and it's an award winner case study on women in construction. So we shall see you then, 3:45. Many thanks.